The bridge of the Indomitable hummed with quiet efficiency as Captain Tassone reviewed the morning reports. His exploration fleet had been patrolling the Outer Rim for 3 months now, charting new star systems and looking for habitable worlds. It was routine work, sometimes boring, but necessary for humanity's expansion into the galaxy. Gu sat at her communications station, monitoring the usual chatter between ships and the occasional burst of cosmic radiation that sounded like static. She had been doing this job for 2 years and could tell the difference between a solar flare and a malfunctioning sensor with her eyes closed. But today, something different caught her attention. At first, it was just a whisper beneath the background noise. Gu leaned forward, adjusting her headset and fine-tuning the receivers. The sound grew clearer, a rhythmic pulse that repeated every 47 seconds. It was artificial. Someone was broadcasting. She immediately flagged it for Captain Tassone,
Allies,
who walked over to her station with Chief Engineer Biora right behind him. They listened together as the strange signal played through the speakers. It was unlike anything in human databases. It's transmitted on a frequency that no Earthship would ever use. Bara ran it through every filter and analysis program they had. The signal was weak, degraded by distance and interference, but it was definitely a message. More importantly, it was a distress call, even without understanding the language. The desperation in the signal's pattern was unmistakable. Captain Tassone called for Hanul, their linguistics expert. She had studied over 40 alien languages since humanity joined the Galactic Assembly 5 years ago. If anyone could decode this message, it was her. Hanul worked through the night, comparing the signal against every known language pattern while the fleet maintained position near the Veil Nebula by morning. Hanul had broken through. She played the translated message for the senior officers in the briefing room. The voice that came through the speakers was soft, musical, and utterly heartbroken. Our world falls to the devourers. Any who can hear this, we beg for mercy. Let our end be witnessed. Please do not let us fade into silence. Our children, our history, our dreams, all will be consumed. If there is anyone out there, remember that we existed. Remember that we tried to survive. The room fell silent. Science Officer Dong Haiyan brought up a star chart and traced the signal's origin. It came from a system 70 light-years away, deep in territory that no human ship had explored. The system appeared on their long-range scans as unremarkable. It's just another yellow star with several planets. But Dong Haiyan's detailed analysis showed something alarming. The 4th planet in that system was lighting up with massive energy signatures. Explosions, weapons, fire. Orbital bombardment on a scale that suggested an entire civilization was being destroyed. First Officer, Yuna stood up and looked at the tactical display. She had served in Earth's defense forces during the resource wars and knew what planetary assault looked like. This was genocide, plain and simple. Someone was methodically wiping out every living thing on that planet. Captain Tassone faced a difficult choice. The fleet's mission parameters were clear. They were explorers, not soldiers. Their orders from Earth Command explicitly stated to avoid military conflicts with unknown species. Humanity was still new to galactic politics, still trying to prove they weren't the violent savages that many older species believed them to be. Getting involved in an alien war could have serious consequences. It could start a conflict that Earth wasn't ready for. It could violate treaties with the Galactic Assembly. It could get his entire crew killed for a people they had never met. But Tassone looked at his officers and saw the same thought on every face. They were human. They came from Earth, a world that had tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways. They survived ice ages and volcanic eruptions and plagues. They survived because humans helped each other, because they didn't abandon people in need. Yuna spoke first. She reminded everyone that humanity didn't claw its way up from the bottom of Earth's food chain just to become bystanders to evil. Every person on these ships had volunteered for deep space exploration knowing they might face danger. This was exactly the kind of danger that mattered. Tassone made his decision, but wanted the crew to agree. He called for a vote, something highly unusual in military operations. Every single member of the 5-ship fleet voted to respond to the distress call. Even Engineer Biora, who usually preferred to avoid conflict, raised her hand in favor. The fleet changed course immediately. Tactical Officer Jin began running combat simulations based on the energy signatures from the target system. Whatever weapons were being used there were far more powerful than anything humanity had encountered before. Marine Commander Subin started drilling her troops, preparing them for potential ground operations. The journey would take 3 days at maximum faster than light speed. During that time, Jiwoo continued monitoring the distress signal. It repeated endlessly the same message over and over. She tried to respond, to let them know that help was coming, but there was no acknowledgement. Either they couldn't hear her, or their communication systems were too damaged to receive. Don Haeon studied what little data they could gather about the alien species sending the signal. Based on the planet's atmosphere and gravity, they were likely smaller than humans, possibly fragile by Earth standards. Their cities showed advanced technology focused on art and science rather than military applications. These were peaceful people facing an enemy they couldn't fight. As the fleet raced through hyperspace, the crew prepared themselves mentally for what they might find. Pilot Kung Soo checked and rechecked his fighter craft, making sure every weapon system was perfect. Medic Yoonji organized the medical bay, stockpiling supplies for mass casualties. On the second day of travel, Hanel detected a change in the signal. It was getting weaker, breaking up more frequently. The aliens were running out of power, or their transmitters were being destroyed. Time was running out. Captain Taesong stood on the bridge as they approached the system, watching the countdown timer tick toward 0. In a few hours, they would drop out of FTL and see what was really happening. His hand rested on the command console, steady and calm. Then, 30 minutes before arrival, the distress signal stopped completely. The sudden silence filled Jiwoo with dread. Either the aliens had been saved by someone else, or there was no one left to save. The fleet dropped into normal space at the edge of the target system, and every screen immediately filled with horror. The view screens showed a vision of absolute destruction. Debris filled the space around the fourth planet, pieces of ships and stations drifting in expanding clouds of wreckage. Some pieces were still burning despite the vacuum of space, their internal atmospheres feeding fires that would burn until nothing remained. Dong Hyan ran immediate scans on the debris field. His voice was quiet as he reported the findings. The destroyed ships belonged to the species that sent the distress call. They called themselves the Velothi. From what the computers could reconstruct, they had possessed a beautiful fleet of exploration and research vessels. Now those ships were nothing but scrap metal and frozen bodies. Captain Taesong ordered the fleet to move slowly through the graveyard. Every screen showed new horrors. Orbital platforms that once housed thousands lay split open like broken eggs. Entire sections of what must have been a magnificent space station tumbled end over end, trailing atmosphere and debris. The Velothi had tried to defend themselves, but it clearly hadn't been enough. The planet itself was worse. The world that the Velothi called home was burning. Massive fires covered entire continents. The oceans were turning dark with ash and pollution. Radiation levels were so high that even with shielding, spending more than a few hours on the surface would be fatal to most species. But the worst part was the ships still in orbit. 3 massive vessels hung above the planet like vultures, methodically firing weapons at the cities below. Each shot created explosions visible from space, erasing city blocks in seconds. These were the Devers. Jae-woo received a transmission from one of those ships. The message was in broken Galactic Common, the trade language used across known space. The voice sounded wrong, like multiple creatures speaking at once through a broken speaker. It said simply, "Softlings. Flee or feed us." Tactical Officer Jin analyzed the Devourer ships quickly. Each one was enormous, 3 times the size of the Indomitable. Their whole composition was unlike anything in human databases, a mixture of organic material and metal that seemed to be alive. Energy readings showed weapons powerful enough to crack a moon. The 3 Devourer ships noticed the human fleet and changed course. They accelerated toward the human vessels with disturbing speed for something so massive. Captain Taesoon had seconds to make a decision. Every logical calculation said to run. His 5 ships couldn't possibly win against those monsters. Yuna looked at her captain and said what everyone was thinking. They had come this far. They had traveled 70 light-years to answer a call for help. Running now would make the entire journey meaningless. The Velothi might be dead, but these devourers would go on to kill others. Someone had to stand against them. Taesoon ordered the fleet into combat formation. It was a maneuver designed for fighting other human ships, but it would have to work. The destroyer Resilient moved to point position, while the frigates spread out to flank. The Indomitable held center, all weapons charging. The first Devourer ship opened fire before entering optimal range. A beam of purple energy lanced across space and struck the Resilient directly. The destroyer's shields flared bright and then failed. The beam cut through the hull like a knife through paper, slicing the ship in half. 300 crew members died in an instant, but the humans didn't retreat. They returned fire with everything they had. Railguns launched magnetically accelerated projectiles at a fraction of light speed. Missiles streaked across the gap, their warheads designed to penetrate heavy armor. Laser batteries painted the Devourer ships with concentrated light. The Devourers took damage, their organic hulls rupturing and bleeding strange fluids into space, but they kept coming. A second beam destroyed one of the frigates. The human fleet was being torn apart, outgunned and outnumbered. Then pilot Kung Su did something insane. He launched his fighter craft and accelerated straight toward the nearest Devourer ship. His fighter was tiny compared to the massive vessel, barely worth noticing. The Devourer's defensive weapons tracked him, but Kyung-Su flew like a man possessed. Dodging fire that should have been impossible to avoid, he armed his ship's self-destruct sequence, crashed directly into the Devourer's engine array. The explosion was massive. The fighter's fusion reactor going critical and taking out the Devourer's primary propulsion. The huge ship began to drift, unable to maneuver. Commander Su-Ben saw the opportunity. She had been waiting with her Marines in boarding pods, ready for a mission that seemed suicidal minutes ago. Now, with one Devourer crippled, she gave the order to launch. The boarding pods shot across space like bullets, small and fast enough to avoid most defensive fire. They punched through the wounded Devourer's hull and deployed magnetic clamps. Su-Ben led the first team through the breach, her rifle ready. Inside the Devourer ship, the Marines found a nightmare. The corridors were made of flesh and metal fused together, pulsing with a sickly light. The air was thick with chemicals that made their armor's filters work overtime. And everywhere coating the walls and floor were the dissolved remains of Velothi civilians. The Marines fought through waves of defender organisms, bioengineered creatures that seemed to grow directly from the ship's walls. They were fast and deadly, with claws that could tear through armor. Private Hyenwoo took 3 down before one got past his guard and ripped into his side. Medik Yoonji pulled him back and sealed the wound while the others kept fighting. Su-Ben led her team deeper into the ship, following a map that Dong-Han was transmitting from the Indomitable. They needed to reach critical systems and plant fusion charges. Every meter was bought with blood and ammunition. They found the ship's processing center, a vast chamber where the Devourers broke down the genetic material of conquered species. Tanks filled with organic soup lined the walls, and machines sorted through the remains, extracting useful DNA sequences. This was how the Devourers evolved, by stealing genes from their victims. The Marines planted their charges and ran. Behind them, the Devourer ship seemed to realize what was happening. The walls convulsed and new defender organisms burst forth, trying to stop the retreat. Sergeant Minho stayed behind to hold a corridor, his rifle blazing until the fusion charges detonated. The explosion tore the Devourer ship apart from the inside. Su-Ben's team made it back to their pods seconds before the hull ruptured completely. They launched back toward the fleet, leaving the dying ship behind. The 2 remaining Devourer vessels retreated toward the planet's surface. They had expected easy prey, and instead found predators. The human fleet was battered and bleeding, down to 3 ships. But still fighting. Then Ji Yu-woo picked up a new signal from the planet below. It was weak and scared, but it was definitely Velothi. A group of survivors had been hiding in underground shelters, and they were begging for help. The Devourers were preparing a final orbital strike to eliminate the last. Resistance Captain Taesoon received a tactical analysis from Jin. aground. Operation on a planet being actively bombarded had a 73% casualty rate. They would be fighting in a toxic environment against an enemy that controlled the high ground. Yuna reminded him why they had come in the first place. The Velothi were still alive down there, still hoping someone would save them. The humans had already lost so much. What was a little more risk compared to abandoning survivors to their fate? The fleet moved into high orbit, weapons ready. Dropships prepared for atmospheric entry. Marines checked their gear one last time. They were going down to hell itself, and they were going to bring those survivors home. The dropships fell through the burning atmosphere like meteors. Inside, Commander Su Ben gripped her harness as the craft shook violently. Her Marines sat in 2 rows facing each other, their faces hidden behind helmets, but their tension obvious in how they held their weapons. Minek Yunji checked her medical supplies for the 3rd time, making sure everything was secure. The ships broke through the cloud layer, and the ruins of Luminara came into view. The city had been beautiful once. Subin could see the remains of crystalline towers that must have caught the sunlight like prisms. Gardens that once held alien flowers were now ash and char. The streets were cracked and broken, filled with debris and the skeletal remains of Velothi who hadn't made it to shelter. Radiation alarms beeped constantly inside the dropships. The environment was lethal. Without their sealed combat armor, the Marines would die in minutes from the toxic air and radiation. Suben wondered how the Velothi survivors were managing underground. The dropships landed hard in what had been a public square. The rear ramps dropped, and the Marines deployed quickly, establishing a defensive perimeter. The ground was still hot from recent bombardment, and small fires burned among the rubble. The sky above was a sickly orange color, filled with smoke and ash. Almost immediately, they made contact with Devourer ground forces. The creatures came scrambling over the ruins. 6-legged monstrosities, the size of horses with blade-like limbs and eyeless heads. They moved with frightening speed, guided by some kind of hive sense. Sergeant Minho opened fire first. His rifle spat armor-piercing rounds that punched through the first creature's chitinous shell. Green blood sprayed from the wounds, but the thing kept coming. 2 more Marines added their fire and finally brought it down, but there were dozens more behind it. The battle turned into chaos quickly. The Devourers were fast and relentless, throwing themselves at the human lines without fear. Private Hyan Wu found himself face to face with one that had broken through. He swung his rifle like a club, smashing it against the creature's head while it tried to stab him with razor limbs. Another Marine shot it off him just in time. While Subin's main force held the landing zone, Lieutenant J. Hyan led a smaller team toward the coordinates of the Velothi shelter. Linguist Hanel went with them, carrying translation equipment. They moved through streets that felt haunted. Past homes and shops that would never see their owners again, they found the shelter. Entrance buried under the collapsed remains of what Dong Han identified as a learning center for children. The door was sealed tight, protected by emergency protocols that had kept the survivors alive. Hanel set up her equipment and began broadcasting on Velothi frequencies. Inside the shelter, 47 Velothi had been trapped for 8 days. They were running out of air and hope. When they heard Hanel's transmission, many thought it was a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation. But Rilith, a scientist who had led her colleagues into the shelter, recognized the language as real. Through the translation software, Rilith spoke with Hanul. Her voice was musical, but exhausted. She asked who the humans were, why they had come. Hanuel told her simply that they heard the distress call and came to help. Rylith began to cry, a sound that translated perfectly across species. The Marines worked to clear the debris from the shelter door. It took precious minutes while the sounds of battle echoed from the landing zone. Finally, the locks disengaged and the door slid open. Warm, stale air rushed out. The Velothi emerged into the toxic daylight. They were smaller than humans, slender builds and large eyes adapted for lower light. Their skin was a pale blue color, covered in delicate patterns that shifted with emotion. Many of them trembled when they saw the armored Marines, these strange aliens with weapons and hard shells. EUNG understood their fear. She removed her helmet despite the danger, exposing her human face to the toxic air for 10 seconds. She smiled at the nearest Valathi and extended her hand in the universal gesture of peace. The Valathi, a young one named Tellin, reached out hesitantly and touched her gloved hand. Then Youngji's suit alarm screamed and she sealed her helmet back on, coughing from the poison she had breathed. But the gesture worked. The Valathi understood that these armored figures were there to help, not harm. The extraction began immediately. The plan was to move the civilians 3 kilometers to the landing zone where the dropships waited. But the Devourers had other ideas. Somehow they detected the shelter opening and sent massive forces to eliminate both humans and Valathi. Commander Subin received reports of a huge enemy wave approaching. She made a tactical decision that she knew might cost her life. Half her Marines would stay behind to hold the extraction point while the rest escorted the Valathi to safety. She would lead the holding force herself. Subin positioned her remaining forces among the ruins, creating choke points and kill zones. She had 43 Marines against an enemy that outnumbered them 20-1. She sent a message to Captain Taesong, telling him that if she didn't make it, should tell her daughter back on Earth that she did her duty. Taesong's response was immediate. Orbital fire support was coming, despite the risk of hitting friendly forces. The fleet's railguns could deliver precision strikes from orbit, but with Marines so close to enemy positions, the margin for error was tiny. The Devourers came like a living wave. They poured over rubble and through broken buildings, their numbers seemingly endless. Subin's Marines opened fire with everything they had. The sound was deafening even through their helmet audio. Dampener held a corridor alone when his squad mates had to fall back with wounded. He was barely 20 years old, fresh from training, but he fought like a veteran. His rifle ran empty, and he switched to his sidearm. That ran empty, and he used his combat knife. For 8 minutes, he held that position, buying time for injured Marines to reach medical care above them. The Indomitable and its surviving escorts unleashed orbital bomb. Tungsten rods fell from space at incredible speeds, hitting with the force of small nuclear weapons. The explosions walked across the Devourer formations, creating craters and throwing bodies into the air. But the enemy kept coming. Private after private ran out of ammunition. They fought with knives, with rocks, with their bare hands when nothing else remained. The Devourers were relentless, driven by their hive mind to eliminate these strange defenders at the landing zone. Lieutenant Jaehaeon got the Valathi loaded onto the dropships. Rilith watched through a viewport as the human Marines fought and died to protect her people. She saw Hyenwu finally fall, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. She saw an older Marine named Dayun drag 2 wounded comrades to cover while taking fire from 3 directions. The Valathi. Scientists understood something profound in that moment. These humans weren't here for resources or territory. They weren't trying to recruit the Valathi for some larger war. They were here simply because it was right, because someone called for help, and they answered. Subin's defensive line finally broke when they ran completely out of ammunition. The survivors fell back in fighting retreat, buying each meter with blood. Subin herself was injured, a devourer claw tearing through her armor and into her shoulder. She kept fighting, using her rifle as a club until Lieutenant Jaehaeon's team arrived with reinforcements. Captain Taesung made a desperate decision. The fleet had experimental teleportation technology, dangerous and unreliable, but it was their only chance. He gave the order to activate it, to pull the surviving Marines directly from the battlefield to the ships in orbit. The teleportation worked mostly. 42 Marines materialized in the Indomitable's transport bay, gasping and disoriented. 3 others died during the process, their bodies torn apart by the unstable technology. But they were alive. The Valathi were safe aboard the dropships launching toward orbit. As the human fleet climbed away from the dying planet, the Devourers unleashed their final bombardment. The entire district where the battle had taken place was obliterated, erased from existence by weapons that turned stone to glass and glass to vapor. The survivors watched from the fleeing ships as Luminara burned. The Valathi mourned their lost world. The humans mourned their dead. But 47 Valathi, civilians, lived because humanity had answered their call. The battered human fleet limped through space toward Haven's Gate, the massive diplomatic station that served as the Galactic Assembly's main hub. The Indomitable had a gaping hole in its port side, sealed with emergency plating. One of the frigates was running on backup power, but they carried precious cargo. 47 Valathi survivors and the bodies of 68 fallen humans. Word of the battle spread faster than the fleet could travel. Quantum communication networks carried the news across the galaxy in minutes. Humanity, the newest species in the assembly, had done the impossible. They had fought the Devourers and survived. More than that, they had rescued civilians from a planet under active bombardment. The reaction from other species was mixed. Some were impressed by human courage. Others were terrified by human recklessness. Many wondered if humanity's aggressive nature made them more dangerous than helpful. The Galactic Assembly called an emergency session to address what they termed the Human Intervention Incident. Captain Tayson sat in the Indomitable's medical bay, watching the doctors work. Medic Yunji moved between beds with calm efficiency, treating human and Valathi patients alike. She had learned Valathi biology on the fly during the rescue, adapting human medical techniques to their different physiology. Several Valathi owed their lives to her improvisation in one bed. Commander Subin lay recovering from her shoulder wound. The Devourer claw had done serious damage, but she would heal. In another bed, young Tellan, the Valathi child, slept peacefully. He had lost his entire family to the Devourers, but Yunji had promised him that her people would make sure the Valathi survived. The fleet arrived at Haven's Gate 3 days after the battle. The station was enormous, a construct of 100 different architectural styles reflecting the diversity of species in the assembly. Docking arms extended to receive the damaged human ships, and medical teams rushed to help with the wounded. Ambassador Ji Young met Captain Taezung at the airlock. She was Earth's representative to the assembly, a veteran diplomat who had spent 5 years trying to build respect for humanity among aliens who viewed Earth as a primitive death world. The battle at Valathi space had complicated her work enormously. She brought Tusung and his senior officers to the assembly chamber. The room was vast, designed to accommodate species of wildly different sizes and environmental needs. Representatives floated in gas clouds, perched on crystalline formations, or sat in pools of liquid methane. All of them stared at the humans with intense interest. The Arbiter, an ancient being named Kelthan, spoke first. His species had been spacefaring for 50,000 years, and he carried the wisdom of ages. He asked the humans to explain their actions. Why had they intervened in a conflict that wasn't theirs? Did they not understand that the Devourers had been destroying civilizations for decades? Did they not calculate the risk to their own survival? Yuna stood to respond. She was still wearing her uniform from the battle, stained and torn but proud. She told the assembly that yes, they had calculated the risk. They understood the danger perfectly, and they would do it again without hesitation. Her words caused a stir through the chamber. Many species whispered to each other through their various translation devices. The concept of deliberately accepting risk to help strangers was foreign to most of them. The Assembly's policy toward Devourers had always been containment and evacuation, never confrontation. Donghan presented their combat data. His analysis showed how human tactics had proven effective against Devourer forces. The humans fought with an aggression that the enemy hadn't expected. They used sacrifice plays and kamikaze runs that no rational species would attempt. But those tactics worked. Tactician Jin explained Earth's military history. Humans had fought each other for thousands of years before reaching space. They had developed warfare into a brutal science. Every engagement was studied, every loss turned into a lesson. When humanity finally unified, all that knowledge combined into a military doctrine designed for one thing: winning at any cost. The assembly listened. Some fascinated, others horrified. Then Rylith asked to speak. The Valathi scientist approached the assembly floor, her body still trembling from trauma, but her voice clear. She told them about the 8 days in the shelter, waiting for rescue that she knew would never come. She described how the Devourers had destroyed everything her people built over thousands of years, and she explained how the Assembly had abandoned them, just as they had abandoned dozens of other worlds. Then Rylith spoke directly to the humans. She thanked them for crossing 70 light-years to save strangers. She told the Assembly that if their ancient wisdom led to inaction while civilizations died, then perhaps wisdom was overrated. Sometimes what was needed wasn't careful planning, but the courage to act. The chamber erupted in debate. Some species argued that humanity's aggression made them dangerous and unpredictable. Others saw an opportunity. If Deathworlders could actually fight Devourers effectively, maybe the tide could be turned. The Korvan Empire, a militaristic species, proposed forming an alliance with humanity to launch offensive operations against. Devourer Breeding World's Ambassador Ji Young navigated the political chaos carefully. She knew humanity couldn't fight the Devourers alone. Earth's fleet was tiny compared to the forces the Assembly could field, but she also recognized that something had shifted. For the first time, other species weren't looking at humans as primitive newcomers, but as potential saviors. The debate continued for hours. Finally, a compromise was reached. The Assembly would not officially declare war on the Devourers. Too many member species were afraid of the consequences. But they would grant humanity emergency military authority to organize a coalition of willing species. Any Assembly member who wanted to fight could join the human fleet voluntarily. It was a political solution that let the Assembly avoid responsibility while still allowing action. Gyeong accepted the terms. Within hours, 17 species volunteered to join the coalition. Some were warrior cultures eager for battle. Others were species that had lost worlds to Devourers and wanted revenge. Captain Taesung, promoted to admiral for his new command, faced an enormous task. He had to integrate alien forces into human tactical doctrine. Engineer Biora worked with technicians from a dozen worlds to standardize weapon systems and communication protocols. It was like building a military from scratch. Pilot Kyong-soo trained alien pilots in human combat maneuvers. Many of them were terrified at first by the aggressive tactics. Diving toward enemy fire instead of away from it went against every instinct. But slowly they learned. The humans showed them that calculated aggression often defeated superior firepower. Hanel made a crucial discovery while studying the Devourer remains that had been brought back from the battle. The creatures possessed a form of genetic memory, a hive mind that connected all Devourer forces across vast distances. Every individual was linked to a central intelligence that coordinated their actions. If they could find and destroy this prime mind, the entire Devourer species might collapse. It was a long shot, but it gave the coalition a concrete target instead of an endless war of attrition. The breakthrough came from Velothi data. Rylith and her surviving colleagues had been studying Devourers for years before the attack. Their research, salvaged from destroyed databases, contained centuries of observations about Devourer behavior patterns. Working with Dong Hyeon, they decoded the location of the prime mind. It was hidden in a region called the Stellar Graveyard, a place where stars went to die. The area was filled with black holes, neutron stars, and spatial anomalies that made navigation nearly impossible. No sane species would try to reach it, but humans weren't sane by galactic standards. They came from a world that tried to kill them daily. They had crossed oceans on wooden ships and climbed mountains because they were there. A stellar graveyard was just another challenge. Admiral Tae soon began planning the most dangerous operation in galactic history. 200 ships from 18 species would attempt to penetrate the stellar graveyard, find the prime mind, and destroy it. The casualty projections were horrifying, but every species that volunteered knew the risks. In the Memorial Hall of the Indomitable, Taeson honored the 68 humans who died at Velothi space. He read their names aloud, a tradition from Earth's ancient naval forces. Among them was Sergeant Minho, who held the line to his last bullet. Commander Subin recovered from her wounds, saluted her fallen Marines, and vowed their sacrifice would matter. The coalition assembled. Alliance forged in the fires of desperate battle. Ships from dozens of worlds gathered around Haven's Gate, preparing for a journey into hell itself. And at the center of it all stood humanity. The Deathworlders who refused to let others die alone. The Coalition fleet assembled at the edge of known space. 200 ships representing 18 different species. At their head was the rebuilt Indomitable, Admiral Tezun, standing on its bridge with quiet determination. Around him, alien vessels of every design imaginable held formation, waiting for the order to jump into the unknown. The stellar graveyard waited ahead, a region of space where physics went mad. Dead stars collapsed into black holes that twisted space and time. Radiation storms could cook a ship in seconds. Gravity wells shifted unpredictably, pulling vessels off course and into crushing forces. It was a place where ships went to die, Navigation Officer. Dayun worked with crystalline beings from the Luminal Collective to plot a course through the chaos. The Luminals could see in dimensions that humans couldn't perceive, sensing distortions in space-time that regular sensors missed. Together, they created a navigation path that looked insane but might just work. The fleet jumped. Reality twisted around them as they entered faster-than-light travel. But instead of the smooth journey through hyperspace, they hit turbulence immediately. Ships shook and alarms screamed. Some vessels lost containment on their FTL drives and dropped back into normal space. Stranded in the deadly region, a Corvin battleship hit a gravity anomaly and was torn apart before it could even send a distress signal. Two smaller frigates from a species called the Nathori collided when their navigation systems failed simultaneously. The Coalition was taking losses before they even reached the target, but the humans pressed forward. Engineer Bora routed power through backup systems when the main drives overloaded. Pilot Kyung-soo manually corrected course deviations, his hands flying over controls with practiced precision. Slowly, painfully, the fleet pushed deeper into the graveyard. After a week of hellish travel, they found it. The Devourer Prime Mind sat on the corpse of a collapsed star, a structure the size of Earth's moon. It was biomechanical like all Devourer technology, but on a scale that defied comprehension. The surface pulsed with dark energy, and thousands of Devourer ships orbited it like guards protecting a queen. Dong Haen's scans revealed the full horror. The Prime Mind wasn't just a command center. It was a living library of genetic information from every species the Devourers had consumed. Millions of years of evolution, stolen and stored. Destroying it would wipe out that knowledge forever. But it would also cripple the Devourer species. Admiral Tezon knew a direct assault would be suicide. The defensive forces were too strong, the Prime Mind's weapons too powerful. Instead, he implemented a three-part strategy that several alien commanders initially refused to participate in. It was that reckless. The fleet divided. The first group, led by Yuna, aboard the cruiser Defiance, would draw the main Devourer force away from the Prime Mind. It was a sacrifice mission. They would engage thousands of enemy ships with only 50 vessels of their own. The survival rate was nearly zero. YUNA accepted the mission without hesitation. She handpicked her commanders, choosing those who understood that sometimes victory required sacrifice. They jumped ahead of the main fleet, broadcasting false signals to make their 50 ships look like the full Coalition force. The Devourers took the bait. 3/4 of their defensive fleet broke orbit and pursued Yuna's force. The battle that followed was brutal beyond description. Ships exploded every few seconds. The Defiance itself took hit after hit, shields failing and hull breaching. But they kept fighting, kept running, drawing the enemy further away. The second group, commanded by tactician Jin, struck at the Prime Mind's defensive platforms. Engineer Bora had equipped their ships with weapons tuned to exploit weaknesses that Dong Haen discovered in Devourer bioarmor, specific resonance frequencies that disrupted cellular bonds and caused their living ships to tear themselves apart. The weapons worked better than expected. Defensive platforms that had stood for centuries began to fail. But the Prime Mind responded by growing new defenses, literally creating weapons from its own mass. Jin's forces had to destroy platforms faster than the Prime Mind could replace them. While the battle raged, the third team launched. Commander Suben led the infiltration force, a mixed group of human marines and alien warriors. She had a young Corvin soldier named Telvok with her, along with Hanul for translation, UNG for medical support, and Lieutenant Jaehin for tactical command. Their ship, a small stealth craft, slipped past the chaos and approached the Prime Mind's surface. They used a combination of human cutting torches and Valathi molecular dissolvers to breach the outer shell. The team dropped into the interior, into corridors of flesh and metal that pulsed with alien life. The Prime Mind knew they were there immediately. Defense organisms emerged from the walls, creatures that were part biological and part machine. They moved fast and killed efficiently. The team fought forward, taking casualties with every meter of progress. Telvok died sealing a breach that would have flooded their corridor with acid. A Nathori scout named Vellum was grabbed by a wall tentacle and pulled into the organic mass, gone in seconds. The team kept moving, stepping over fallen comrades, driven by the knowledge that billions of lives depended on them. Hot-Null found the Prime Mind's communication center deep in the structure. She made contact with its central intelligence and experienced something unexpected. The Prime Mind showed her visions, memories from before the Devourers became monsters. They had been created as weapons by an ancient species that died out millennia ago. Left without purpose, they did the only thing they were programmed to do: consume and evolve. The Prime Mind was lonely. It had existed for thousands of years with only the endless hunger driving it forward. It showed Hanul what it felt, a being that wanted to stop but couldn't. Trapped by its own nature? For a moment, Hanul wondered if there was another way. Could they reprogram the Devourers? Give them a new purpose? Then she thought about Refuge 9. She remembered Talon's lost family and the billions who had died screaming as the Devourers consumed them. She remembered every world that had fallen to this hunger. She uploaded the virus. It was a digital toxin developed by combined human and Valathi programming. It's designed to corrupt the genetic memory network that held the Devourer species together. The Prime Mind screamed as the infection spread, sound that echoed across quantum channels and reached every Devourer in the galaxy. The structure began to collapse. Walls convulsed and floors buckled. Suben ordered immediate evacuation. The team ran through disintegrating corridors while the Prime Mind died around them. Lieutenant Jaehin stayed behind to manually trigger the fusion charges they had planted, ensuring complete destruction. His last transmission was to his son back on Earth. He said simply that the stars were safe now, to live well. Then the charges detonated, and Jaehin was gone. The infiltration team escaped seconds before the Prime Mind exploded. The detonation was visible across half the sector. A burst of energy that marked the end of a species that had terrorized the galaxy for generations. Across known space, Devourer ships went dark. Their crews died as the hive connection severed, leaving them unable to function independently. The Coalition fleet regrouped, counting their losses. Yuna's sacrifice force had been reduced to 12 ships from 50. Jin's strike force lost 30 vessels to the defensive platforms. Overall, 80 ships and 30,000 souls from a dozen species had died in the battle. But they had won. The journey back through the stellar graveyard was quieter. The survivors mourned their dead and tended their wounded. Yunji worked around the clock in the medical bays, saving lives with skill and determination. Dayun navigated them home, her steady hand guiding the fleet through the chaos. Haven's Gate welcomed them as heroes. Billions across the galaxy watched via holotransmission as the battered fleet docked. The Galactic Assembly held a ceremony honoring the fallen from all species. Rilith spoke for the Valathi, declaring that humanity had shown what true civilization meant, not avoiding danger, but standing against it to protect others. Admiral Taesoon stood with his surviving officers on the station's observation deck. Yuna, Suben, Giwu, Bora, Donghun, Kungsu, Doyun, Yunji, and Honol. They were tired and scarred. But they had changed the galaxy. Ambassador Jiang formally accepted the Assembly's recognition on behalf of Earth. She promised that humanity would always answer when someone called for help across the void. Other species, inspired by human courage, began volunteering for a permanent defense force. The coalition became something more, a lasting alliance dedicated to protecting the innocent. Months later, on a human colony world, young Talon looked up at the stars. He wore a cadet uniform, having joined Earth's Naval Academy. Around him were children from 20 different species, all training together under human instructors. They were learning the Deathworlder way: courage, sacrifice, and the absolute refusal to abandon those in need. Talon thought about his lost family and his destroyed homeworld. The pain would never fully go away. But he also thought about the humans who crossed impossible distances to save strangers. He thought about Commander Subin holding the line, about Yunji promising him survival, about all the species working together to end the threat. The SOS had echoed through the void, desperate and alone. But the fleet of Deathworlders heard it loud and clear. They answered with fire and blood and sacrifice. They proved that, in a galaxy full of ancient civilizations, sometimes what was needed most was the reckless courage of a young species from a death world. The Devourers were gone. New threats would come, as they always did. But now the galaxy knew that when the call went out, when someone needed help against impossible odds, humanity would come running, and they would bring friends.